Okay, so this is a video lecture on the third meditation of Descartes, of God that He exists. In the beginning of the third meditation, Descartes goes back to applying his methodological doubt to sensory experience. He also reviews what he has discovered so far, the certainty of his existence, and his nature as a thinking thing, or res cogitans. Such a certainty provides Descartes the idea that if it is possible to discover something as certain, there must be a way to determine other certain things by examining the way through which the discovery of it is attained, which is by looking at the whole theme of what has been done with the first and second meditation. This is what Descartes applies as his method, examining the way through which the discovery of certainty is attained. So what Descartes noticed is that this certainty of the self is a clear and distinct perception. Clear and distinct perception will not be able to provide such certain knowledge if it is in any way fallible or tend to be erroneous or has the tendency to be an error. So this then leads Descartes to his general rule. So whatever perception there is that is clearly and distinctly perceived, must be true. However, one might ask the question, what does it mean for something to be a clear and distinct perception? What makes the cogito a clear and distinct perception? So what makes it clear and distinct perception is that we are certain of its truth, of its existence. That is, even if even if its existence is doubted, one would still end up doubting. Hence, res cogitans. Even if Descartes doubts his own doubting, he still ends up doubting. That's why his conclusion was that his nature, the nature of this I which meditates, is a thinking thing, res cogitans. However, this certainty seems insufficient to be a full proof, meaning to say incapable of going wrong. So this certainty seems insufficient to be a foolproof guide towards knowledge. In other words, it is possible to be certain of something that turns out to be false. And I think all of us have experienced this in one way or another. In fact, Descartes even admitted to experiencing something as certain and to manifesting it to be dubious, which is that of sensory experience. However, what is clear and distinct with such experience is that he has those ideas. He still possesses these ideas in his mind. So, even if it turns out that he is being deceived of such sensory experiences, it remains clear and distinct that he is still having an idea of such an experience. Further, what about the certainty in mathematics? Example 2 plus 3 equals 5. Descartes stated already that even such propositions are not immune to doubt, since it is possible that there is a God, a supreme being, and that this God is deceiving him about these matters. It is at this point that the existence of God has not yet been established. As such, to see whether the reason for doubting mathematical propositions holds, Descartes examines the question of God's existence, and if God exists, whether he can ever deceive. Without the knowledge of these two propositions, Descartes cannot be certain of anything. So, in order to determine whether God exists, what Descartes did first was to make a distinction of thoughts, which for him could be divided in three kinds. We have ideas, volitions or affections, and judgments. By thought, Descartes means any state of mind, including perceiving, willing, doubting, fearing, and knowing. So, by an idea, Descartes means the content of a thought, what the thought is about, or what it states. When considered by themselves alone, ideas could neither be true nor false without relating them to anything else. When considered as mere modes of thought, ideas cannot be a cause of error. It is in the level of judgment where truth and falsity enters the picture. That is, when one judges an idea in relation to what exists in reality. So, in other words, when considered by itself alone, the idea of a unicorn is true, can neither be true, can neither be false. Precisely because you have not yet related it to anything that exists in reality. So the judgment there would be it will become false when you cannot relate it to what exists in reality. So there are, aside from the distinction, there are origins of ideas. So Descartes says some ideas are innate, some are adventitious or caused by something outside the eye, and some are fictitious, or in other words, invented by me. So the capacity for recognizing the truth comes from the faculty of understanding, which is only located in the eye, while the source of sensory experiences comes from something external to me or to the eye. However, it should be noted that at this point, Descartes is not advancing that these different origins are really the case, meaning to say that they are definite. No, he's not saying that. He's not trying to put forward the idea that these origins of ideas are definite, meaning to say cannot be changed. Since perhaps they can all be subsumed into one. He is only asserting that this is how it presently appears to him. So one major task of Descartes in the third meditation is to consider those ideas which he thinks proceed from external objects. and examine what made him to think that the ideas are similar to objects. But what made him think that some of his ideas are adventitious? It is because Descartes holds the view that what has been called representational theory of perception. So according to this view, when a person perceives a material object, the object causes an idea in the person's mind. The person has absolutely certain knowledge of the idea, and the idea gives the person knowledge of the object by representing it. So it does so by resembling at least some of its properties. What are the reasons of Descartes for holding such a view? Uh, for holding this representational theory of perception? So he provides two reasons. First is that he is instructed by nature to believe this, which means that he has a certain spontaneous inclination which impels him to believe, but not a natural light to recognize that it is true. Only a spontaneous inclination. So natural light means the recognition of a clear and distinct perception. It is clear that Descartes' first reason is unconvincing, even for him, since an inclination that is not a clear and distinct perception will always be open to doubt. Second is that these ideas occur to him independently of his own will. But even this is not enough to convince Descartes, since it is possible that there's a faculty in his mind which creates these ideas and this faculty is still unrevealed to him, as in the case when he is sleeping and thinking that his dreams are caused by something external to him, when in fact they are not. Descartes says that experience shows him that objects perceived do not depend on his own will and on himself, for for they often intrude, or in other words, be forced or thrust into upon him against his own will. Example, the feeling of heat from fire. So whether one wants it or not, especially when you're near the fire, whether one wants it or not, it comes to him as distinct from himself, as if the thing transmits its own likeness rather than anything else. So another difficulty is that even if one grants the ideas are caused by something external to themselves, this does not follow that these ideas faithfully resemble their objects. In other words, for Descartes, the notion that ideas faithfully resemble their objects is not true in many cases. Descartes gave us the example of the sun, or rather the idea of the sun. The idea, which has originated from the senses, meaning adventitious, tells us that the sun is small. By our own experience already, when you look at the sun, when you try to look at the sun, isn't it that it appears as small? However, according to astronomical reasonings, which are then innate or has been produced by the eye in some way, the sun is actually much larger than the earth. So these two conflicting ideas about the sun cannot both resemble what the sun really is. Only one of them is true. And the idea that came directly from the senses is the one dissimilar to the external object being resembled. As such, Descartes needs to find a better way to prove that there are ideas whose causes are something external to him. So, in line with that aim, Descartes first notices that the nature of ideas is such that there is no difference or inequality among them. In other words, they proceed from him in the same manner. But when ideas are seen as images, meaning some ideas represent some things while others represent another, they become different. So ideas that present substances have more objective reality within them. Meaning to say, they participate in a higher degree of being or perfection than those ideas which simply represent modes or accidents. So the idea of God, which is to say eternal, infinite, immutable, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, and creator of all things, which are outside of himself, has certainly more objective reality in itself than those ideas by which finite substances are represented. So it is here where Descartes distinguishes the levels of reality. So we have formal reality and objective reality. So for Descartes, formal reality is actual existence. Objective reality, on the other hand, or by contrast, is the type of being that an idea has in virtue of its representational content, and so is often referred to as representational reality. It is important to see the two different ways of looking at ideas according to Descartes. First, considered merely as states about thinker, all ideas have the same status. They are just modes or accidental properties of the thinker. Second, but considered as representations of their objects, they do not all have the same status, for some of them represent other modes or properties. Some represent finite substances, and one represents an absolutely infinite substance, namely God. So it is important to note that at this point, Descartes still has not proven the existence of God. What is only certain is the existence of res cogitans and res extensa, the substances of res cogitans and res extensa. Thus, one might object how Descartes has made the claim that there are different degrees of reality. That is, finite substances have more objective reality than mere properties, and that God has more objective reality than finite substances. The answer is that by objective reality, Descartes is talking about the degree of reality that the things would have had if they have existed. Again, objective reality for Descartes is the degree of reality that the things would have had if they have existed. Thus, Descartes' notion of reality must not be confused with actual existence. So Descartes begins his argument, his famous Cartesian causal argument for God's existence, with this principle. There must at least be as much reality in the efficient and total cause as in its effect. Since I am a thinking thing and one that has the idea of God in myself, it must be admitted that whatever caused is finally assigned to me must also itself be a thinking thing, and one that has the idea of all perfections I is ascribe to God. In other words, since we have concluded together with Descartes that the nature of the I is a thinking thing, and then that its existence is clear and distinct. In other words, cannot be refuted. And since it has been proven to exist, then there must be something of the existence of this I that traces back to its origin, namely God. So Descartes' reason for holding this principle is that the cause is the only source of an effect's reality, what I'm trying to explain. And the cause would not be able to transfer this reality unless the cause possesses it in itself. In other words, since the I is existing, we are the I. Each of us is the I, the thinking thing. Since we are existing, what has caused us this existence must itself be existing. Because God cannot give existence when he himself does not have existence on his own. So the implications of this are: first, something cannot come from nothing since nothing has no reality whatsoever. And an object that possesses greater reality cannot come from something that has less reality in itself. So let's go now to the core argument of Descartes in proving God's existence. There are actually three premises and one conclusion. Let's go first with the first two. So the core argument of Descartes in proving God's existence. So this is a simplified version which could be formulated as follows. First, I have an idea that represents an actually infinite being having all perfections. Second, everything that exists has a cause of its existence. So the second premise, everything that exists has a cause of its existence, is a statement of the general causal principle, ex nihilo nihil fit, which has a long pedigree in philosophy. Unlike the other cause principles employed in the third meditation, the ex nihilo nihil fit principle does not make any assumptions about degrees of reality or different kinds of being. Every major early modern rationalist and even some empiricists like Locke accepts this general principle, as does Aristotle and his scholastic followers. So, from the perspective of these traditions at least, this second premise is unobjectionable. Third, the only possible cause of this idea is an actually infinite being. So Descartes asked the reader or the meditator to take stock of his ideas and notice an important difference between the idea of God and the ideas of all finite substances. That is to say, that he could be the cause of the latter of all these finite substances. These other ideas can be constructed by borrowing elements from the idea he has of himself, or in the case of ideas of angels, by borrowing elements from the idea of himself and the idea of God. Since the idea of an angel represents a substance more perfect than himself, but less perfect than God. So in drawing out attention to this contrast between the idea of God and the ideas of all other things, Descartes is appealing to an intuitive account of how invented ideas are formed. One takes other ideas or their elements and combines them in novel ways. Of course, an empiricist such as Hume might object that the idea of God is formed in the same way. The idea of divine knowledge is of something actually infinite, that is, a completed infinity. But the idea produced by augmenting the idea of finite knowledge would only be of a potential infinity. One cannot form an idea of actual infinity by endlessly augmenting the idea of something finite. In contrast to what might be the object against this idea of God. So again, one cannot form an idea of an actual infinity by endlessly augmenting the idea of something finite. Any more than one can produce an infinite number by endlessly adding finite numbers. In other words, it could not be refuted that the idea of actual infinity came from the idea of finite. Precisely because you cannot create an actual infinity idea with a finite idea. In other words, what Descartes is trying to say here, why do I still have this idea of perfection? Why do I have in me, despite my being finite, have this idea of the infinite? So the idea of actual infinity is also prior to the idea of potential infinity. One sees that the product formed by endlessly augmenting the idea of finite knowledge is incomplete, precisely because one has a prior idea of the completed infinity, which is God. And therefore, an actually infinite being exists. God exists. So again, the core argument, as simplified. First, I have an idea that represents an actually infinite being having all perfections. Second, everything that exists has a cause of its existence. Third, the only possible cause of this idea is an actually infinite being. Therefore, an actually infinite being exists. And that's the gist of the third meditation of Descartes. And it could be said this is one of the strong arguments of Descartes in proving God's existence. He will talk about this later on in his later meditations, but even at this stage in this third meditation, he already has a strong argument for God's existence. Okay? Thank you for listening.